Hello and good morning, and welcome to Queering the Fantasy with me, Thom Seddon, I suppose I should say, because none of you know who I am. And this morning I'm in conversation with some Bolster Books authors where we'll be tapping into the delicious smorgasbord that is queering fantasy and sci-fi. So thank you for joining us for this short and sweet panel. And in the digital realms as well, because the world's still a little bit crazy, but it's so nice to be able to do something. So thank you to Leeds LGBTQ Literature Festival for putting all of this on. So yeah, for those of you who don't know me, I'm a writer and entertainer based in Nottingham, where I live with my husband, our two cats, and in my downtime, when I have any, watch far too much Judge Judy, because everyone needs a vice. Unfortunately, Ileandra Young couldn't make it today. However, at literally the 11th hour, the fabulous Jess Faraday has stepped in to join us. So I will introduce her first. Jess is a California girl. I took this from your website about 20 minutes ago. So Jess is a California girl living in the wilds of Scotland with her family and loving every minute of it. And her new novel, The Fiend in the Fog, is coming out with BSB in August 2021. And then next we have the wonderful Brey Willows. So she is a longtime editor and writer. And when she's not running a social enterprise working with marginalized communities on writing projects, she's editing other people's writing, as well as squeezing in doing her own. So very busy lady. She lives in the middle of England with her wife and fellow author, Robin. But it's looking very serene and beach-like from wherever you're coming to us right now.
We'll pretend. It's all
Absolutely.
pretend. It's all fantasy, right?
Yeah. And your next book's coming up. You've got Song of Serenity out in December. And last but not least, making this officially an international affair, coming all the way from Canada at God knows what time in the morning, you poor soul. Is it 6 a.m., 5 a.m.?
It's 6 a.m.
Yeah, you've got something to fuel you this morning. Yeah, there it is. Just neat vodka.
Ooh, no.
We have the brilliant Nathan Burgoine, and he is a tall queer writer of mostly shorter queer speculative fiction and or romance novels. So you've published dozens of short stories, 5 novellas, and occasionally novels do happen, including your semi-superhero story, the Lambda-nominated Life, and a YA novel, Exit Plans for Teenage Freaks. I mean, goodness, all of you people have got so much going on all the time, and I'm just sat here with makeup on. And a Little Village Blend, contemporary romance with a dash of the speculative, is your most recent release, I believe?
It is indeed. It just came out this month.
Just came out this month. Wonderful. And you're over in Ottawa, Canada, as I said, with your husband Daniel. And I did notice your rescued husky Max, who I now have to ask, is Max there? And can we say hello?
No, because Max, if Max was here, he'd be knocking everything over. The reason that I always do Zooms from my library is it's the only door in the house that has a round knob instead of a handle, because any other door he will open and come blasting in. So.
I mean, a bit too much chaotic energy, obviously, for 6 a.m. on a Zoom panel, isn't it? Well, that was just for my own selfish reasons, because I'm slightly obsessed with huskies. So yes, if you're already completely besotted with one or all of us, as I anticipate you must be by now, then you can check out all of the links for the releases and websites and whatnot. So they will be posted in the chat as we go along by our very glamorous behind-the-scenes assistant at the Literature Book Fest. So that's enough admin, I believe, and introductions. So now we can get over to some questions, and I will keep an eye on the time because I love to chat and there's a lot of things I want to know about you guys and your work. So first up, I'm going to start with you, Brey, because this is a question I've slightly plagiarized off yourself from a talk that I attended that you recently did.
Nothing like plagiarism. I love it.
I mean, I'm crediting it in my references, so I feel like it's okay.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm holding my hand up and saying, I nabbed this from you, and I'm going to reflect it back. Yeah, you asked a very similar question, which was basically about what first got you fascinated or connected with words. Like, what was the first book that ever sprung out at you? So I wanted to ask, what was the genesis of your dive into this genre, basically, with fantasy and sci-fi? So What or who is the culprit?
Well, first of all, I feel like that's a way better plagiarized version of what I asked. That's way better. Let's see. I loved to read, and I started out with like Nancy Drew and the mystery fun stuff. But one day I was at a friend's house when I was about 13, and he gave me this really like messed up copy of the Dragon Riders of Pern, and it was just mind blowing. I mean, it was like this big, and I devoured it. And I thought, I want a world of dragons. And it was kind of my first, like, wow, I want to watch dragons hatch. And from that point forward, I was absolutely hooked on fantasy. And then I kind of moved into sci-fi a little bit with like Robert Heinlein and things, but I found I wasn't quite smart enough for it. Like it confused me. I was always lost. So I retreated back to fantasy mostly. But I think that's where my love of it began, with this world of dragons. And then it became this epic series. And I think when I'm writing, I always kind of return to that and this idea of big epic worlds. And yet, even if they're, just low fantasy here, there's something about that I just love it. I absolutely love it.
It is that traditional of the hand-me-down chunky doorstop of a book that you go, I can't possibly read that. And then when you start, oh no, I can, and I'm going to stay up until 6 a.m. in the morning.
Yeah,
trying to,
exactly.
The word is devour. A similar experience with me. My dad said, well, you like Terry Pratchett and you've enjoyed some Neil Gaiman. Let's move you on to David Eddings, which is far more complex. So yeah, it is that initiation almost of someone who says, hey, you should read some of this.
yeah, exactly.
Nathan, how about yourself?
I think for me the big draw was a Canadian author named Charles DeLint, who I actually bumped into a bit later in my life. But he wrote these wonderful interconnected short stories, which is a phrase I'm probably going to say so often, I'm sorry ahead of time. But they were set in this place called Newford, which was like this fictionalized version of the United States. But like Brey just mentioned, it had this low fantasy. There was like this little touch of magic, or this little trace of magic. And I had been loving the urban paranormals for years. But this one, where it was like that magic was dialed all the way down to like only 1 or 2, it just completely captured me. There was one story where this guy who's maybe a little bit off was freeing bicycles from their bike chains. So these bike thieves were just following him and trying to steal the bikes, but then all the bicycles decide to protect him. And so all of a sudden, all these bicycles are racing around by themselves. And it was amazing. And I just had this magical moment of like, this is the kind of stuff I want to write, this slightly weird stuff. And even more, he had a couple of queer characters in there, which if you guys remember reading in the 80s and 90s, that was incredible, right? So yeah, it was Charles DeLint. And from him, I found others, but I put most of it down to Charles.
That's I love those those little stories that it could. I mean, it is true. It's got to be true. It sounds true, but it's odd. I think there's I can't remember where it came from. There's like a very famous one of someone talking about their neighbor who kept on pouring washing up powder down the drain. And someone asked her, why do you keep on pouring washing powder down the drain? I don't understand. And her response was, somebody has to feed them.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's very, very unsettling, very bizarre, but absolutely true. It happened. Thank you so much. And last but not least, Jess, where did your first steps into the realms of fantasy begin?
Let's see, I think it started with my dad. He was always giving me books to read that were a little bit beyond me thematically and definitely scientifically. And one of the books that he gave me that meant a lot to me was Something Wicked This Way Comes. And I've always liked that sort of I don't know, intervention of the magical into the mundane world. And later growing up, I really started developing an appreciation for lighthearted, comedic, supernatural type things. I was a great fan of Scooby-Doo and the Ghostbusters, and I've been trying to write lighthearted this year. My pandemic project has been trying to write lighthearted, but it never seems to turn out that way. It always, these deeper themes, my dad would give me, Vonnegut and, all of these things, these deeper themes and cynicism always seem to work their way into it. But that's where it started for me.
No, wonderful. I mean, I think it is like my dad could very much see that I was really into kind of like the fantasy, and also I'm not gonna lie, I read Goosebumps religiously as a kid. I mean, they're still on the bookshelf, they're just behind me. I still have them. I'm in my 30s. So that was the exact same thing of, oh well, now let's kind of upgrade you almost. If you like that, you can read this next. Soon you're going to grow out of R.L. Stein eventually. Like, you don't know it yet, but you will. You'll want something more.
That's right. That's right.
Oh, absolutely. But it's interesting because we've sort of already touched on it a little bit of, what kind of inspirations are. But my next question, what I wanted to kind of go into, and I'll continue with you actually, Jess, because you're already maybe thinking about it a little bit. So how much do you base your fantasy writing kind of in the reality that is around you? Because we've been sort of saying about science fiction that's a little bit beyond our grasp. It gets a little bit more kind of complicated, obviously.
Well, I write historicals primarily.
I was going to say Fiend in the Fog. Obviously, you can't time travel back to, it's 1865 East London, isn't it? So.
1885, and I write historicals primarily, and I have set them in London, but now that I'm living in Edinburgh, I'm starting to write stories set in Edinburgh, and I rarely set out to write a supernatural story. It just kind of creeps in sometimes. The Fiend in the Fog, actually, I was working on it and having the hardest time writing it. It was supposed to be kind of a lighthearted Scooby-Doo adventure where in the end they rip off the mask and it's some money-grubbing capitalist who wants to, get all of the toys for himself. But my writing group were reading the first 3 chapters and they were saying, well, obviously this character is a werewolf. And I said, what, really? That's obvious? Well, and I thought about it, and that was the missing piece. And that gradually turned into the kind of the monsters as metaphor, which is this book. Each of the characters has an actual monster that they have to figure out why is it there and what is its purpose and how can they channel that purpose into something positive and useful, rather than just here is a monster, let's get it. And I don't know.
I mean, coming soon to a English literature course near you to unpack the whole thesis behind that. That's incredible.
I know. Somebody said, I'd like to give your book to my teenager. Is it appropriate for children? And I said, well, there's nothing graphic in there, but it's not a monster story, really. It's more philosophy.
Yeah.
So.
If you want to turn your child into someone who just has to stare out the window and think all the time, then give them this novel. And now, Nathan, with yours, I do remember you saying that, so some of your work, or a lot of your work, depending how you look at it, is it's in a fictionalized version of the Ottawa village, so it is grounded in part of your reality, and that's village as in gay village, not as in Vicar of Dibley.
Right.
just to clarify.
Yeah. So I tend to approach the magic or the psychic or whatever in my stories from a thematic point of view more than anything else. So for me, the village is often my way of talking about how the past and the future and the connections and inheritance of queer narrative and how difficult that is, because we don't have, well, most of us, I always say this when I'm on a panel with Brey, most of us don't have queer parents talking to our queer kids and so on about our own heritage, right? For example, the first story in the village in my collection of Echoes Born, the theme explored there is like, you know, how scary it is as a queer kid to like, what if they can tell, how do they know, like, you know, can people see just by looking at me? Well, I gave that character the ability to see how other people feel. So he's constantly seeing what everybody else feels, but to queer it up a notch, he has no idea what any of it means. He just sees these funny colors. And so him and his friend are literally writing a manual as they go, figuring out like, well, what does red mean? What does blue mean? What does that weird cloud pattern mean? And, you know, the sort of jokey line is the only thing worse than not knowing what people think about you is knowing what people think about you. So yeah, I do absolutely ground it in the here and now, in the village especially, but the magic is generally exploring some facet of queerness in a way that doesn't make it like, and now we're going to talk about being queer.
Like, here come the rainbows.
Yeah.
No, I really appreciate that there's kind of like the subtle nuances. I have this conversation with people a lot about the kind of near, I don't want to say crimes against queer literature, and I've committed many of them myself, you know, where someone's got a drug problem, someone's got a religious background, like, don't always have to do that if it's not going to be integral to the story, or if you're not saying anything new or fresh, you're kind of just rehashing these terrible tropes that we as a community somehow got wedged into, or sort of backed ourselves into a corner. So yeah, subtle nuances, excellent. And as for queer parents, I mean, I've seen pictures of my dad in the 70s. I'm on the fence, and I think so is he. Oh, wonderful. And Brey, for your upcoming Song of Serenity, did you do some field research and go to the Temple of the Muses in Scotland? You did your research and development? Yeah.
I did. Yeah.
I had to ask.
Yeah, I absolutely did. Because, you know, most of my stuff is based in mythology. Because I love myth and how it forms so much of our current culture. And we don't even think about how that works. So yeah, I looked up temples to muses just out of curiosity to see if there were any, you know, in history. And it turned out there was one in Scotland that's current. And I'm like, why? And it's this tiny little like Dibley village. Like, you'd never go there. There's no reason to go there. But there's a temple to the muses, like on this hill, and it was just perfect for what I needed, and it changed the directory of, you know, the whole direction of my story.
Maybe it should have been called Songs of Serendipity, if that's how you came across this temple.
Yeah, and now I want to write a queer Dibley as well. Like,
absolutely,
that's gonna have to happen. So. Yeah, it's and I think, you know, like Nathan, I tend to write low fantasy. So, you know, all the stuff based in our world that's just a little off or unusual. And I mean, I don't know, Jess and I just had a quick like back and forth about Nathan's work before she came on, and like, if you haven't read Nathan's books, they will make you stop breathing. I mean, they're just so beautifully written. And the Exit Plans for Teenage Freaks, if you want your kids to read, choose that, because it's just, oh, I loved it so much. Anyway, I'll stop gushing. What was the question, Thom?
I mean, I think you kind of answered it by saying, because I was asking how much of your fantasy is based in reality, and by you saying that you do a lot of, sorry, you just said like low fantasy where it's our world, but it's not. It's with that twist on it, that spin of the what if question, rather than the imagine that, where you're like world building and creating something from scratch, I suppose. but you did just very coherently and smoothly lead into my next question. Very, very nicely. Because you said about if you want your kids to read, then, you know, send them Nathan's literature, absolutely, you know, get your copy to date, pass it on. But in an article that I was reading, it was quite a while ago, so I had to Google it again to make sure that I was giving credit where credit was due. So it was in an interview with Alex London, and the person interviewing them was Carolyn Cox. And what Alex was asked, and I'm pinching this question verbatim because it's great, there's a really great thing happening where lots of creators are now writing and telling the stories they wish they'd had when they were kids. Is that something that you can relate to? So I'll go back to you, Brey, since we were already chatting.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would have loved to have seen queer characters, but I was really lucky to have a lesbian parent. And so I grew up in the community, so I never really felt outside. And I think that's a crazy, unusual thing for people in my age group, particularly. I think younger people now experience that a bit more. But I was really lucky to go to pride events with my mom, you know, in the 80s and 90s, and she was quite young, so, you know, lots of lesbian parties where I found bras in my bedroom when I woke up and things like weird shit, but, you know, because it was the 80s, you know. So I didn't have quite the same need for that literature, which, like Nathan says, you know, he writes it because he wants people to have that. Whereas I was so lucky to already be in the community, so that when I came out, I just said to my mom, you know, this girl in class wrote me a love letter, and she said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I think I'll go out with her." And she went, "Okay." And that's, you know, that's the whole sum of my coming out story, you know, which obviously, you know, is quite unusual, but I love being able to be part of where I can say, you know, go read Nathan's books, you know, give a teenager Nathan's books. And there's so much out there for people who have felt alone and who want to see themselves in books where they don't have to die or have a drug problem or, you know, be put in an asylum, or, you know, where they can just like be the hero, and that's that.
Yeah, precisely. So, yeah. I mean, from my generation, a lot of the kind of representation was always the incredibly like stereotypical, incredibly like flamboyant, and that's sort of it's a little bit of a mixed bag, because you like that representation, but then at the same time, if you don't 100% identify with it, you kind of think, well, am I just supposed to act like that because that's what I'm seeing? So, you know, maybe I should try and emulate it. And then, oh, it ends up with so much internalized queer phobia and this whole sort of thing. It would have been so much easier if someone could have just handed me a book to get lost in and go, oh, look, I'm me, wonderful. Precisely. Jess, what about yourself?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I felt keenly growing up, I loved adventure stories, and again, supernatural adventure stories and investigation of the supernatural. And that's a very male heavy genre. I'm active in different Fortean groups and Bigfoot groups and things. There are very, very few women there, and very few women in leading roles. And so one of I write a lot of different things, but one of the things I try to write are women and bisexual and lesbian women in these leading adventurous roles that I always wanted to see and never did.
No, I mean, I
not never, but you know, it's you always see there are these wonderful shows and stories that come out now, you know, and it's always some, you know, slick, smart talking man who is leading the ghost investigation, or, you know, or whatever. And well, how about a smart talking woman?
Absolutely.
doing. And maybe she has a female love interest too.
I mean, again, it's behind me on the shelf once more, but I think that's why Buffy the Vampire Slayer blew so many people's minds as a sci-fi insanity thing, because you do realize in this that the blonde pretty girl kills the monsters.
Yes.
She doesn't get chased by them.
And that's what made that show iconic.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And we won't even tap into season 4 when Willow came out and became a very powerful Wiccan, and that was just when it really got going. Again, that sense of, look, a me on television, how wonderful. A member of my community, visible on primetime television.
Yes.
And Nathan, I mean, I feel like you've kind of already answered this question, but is there anything more that you would like to add?
I think the one thing, and I bring this up every Pride especially, is I always want to caution when we talk about how we didn't have these books when we were young. So often those books existed, but the gatekeepers kept them away from us.
Yeah.
And I mean, and I understand why it happens. We don't have that interconnected heritage, right? But I've seen people like very young authors, bless them, saying things like, there were no queer books when I was a kid, and they're in their 20s. I'm like, there were many, many, many queer books when you were a kid. You just weren't allowed to find them. And so, but yeah, like, I mean, Nancy Garden was what, at the 80s? Any on My Mind. You can go back, like, When I Get There, It Better Be Worth the Trip. That was 60 something, right? Like, so there were these wonderful books even for queer youth, but I mean, it wasn't like the librarians could give them to us. Our parents weren't going to give them to us unless we were lucky. And so they might as well have not been there. But a huge part of it for me is to try to make sure that those books don't get forgotten. Because if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be able to write the ones we were writing.
I mean, when my husband told me to read this book, he said, "Oh, it's called The Well of Loneliness" by Radcliffe Hall, and I'd never heard of it. And then when I found out when it was written, I was like, "Oh wow!" Like she went there.
Yeah, and it feels like a betrayal. Like, I remember when I first started working at the bookstore in the 90s, and I had access to books in print on microfiche, and I was scrolling these microfiches, and there's this whole gay category, and it went on for slide after slide after slide in gay fiction. I'm like, well, where was this? And it wasn't in your local WH Smith.
But as you said, it is about things being hidden, kind of locked away almost, because Morris by Ian Forster, of course, was published after his death. I think there's a story, it was found in a desk with a note on the front that said publishable, but at what cost, ? And also he'd confided in close friends that he'd really struggled with the ending because he didn't want it to be miserable, because so many, LGBTQ people were miserable, and it was really important that you didn't write this story. Well of Loneliness, totally opposite direction, very much a very miserable ending. So harrowing, really, had to put the book away from myself.
Do you know, though, I think, kind of going to what you're saying, Nathan, I think there's still a sense sometimes that we're not out there. Like people, I've come across people all the time at like Pride and stuff when we have got book booths, and they say, I didn't even know these books existed. And you think, are you looking for them, first of all? Or like, is just a new concept for you? But then a couple of years ago, there was a Dyslexia article that said there are no new lesbian writers, and basically saying that like Val McDermott and Emma Donoghue were kind of it, and there was nobody else writing lesbian fiction anymore. Obviously, I took that very well.
Like a professional.
Like a professional. I didn't write emails at all, or articles, or blogs, or letters to the editor.
It's got to be done.
But I mean, this was in a writing magazine only a few years ago, and I think what the author of that article was actually saying was there are no new mainstream lesbian authors. And I think that's really hurtful to the rest of us, because we don't tend to, our characters are queer and happy, and therefore we end up not in the mainstream.
And the mainstream has such a Highlander problem, right? Like there can be only one at any given time. They refuse to have more than one lesbian and one black person and what, you know, like it's like, this is the new whoever, sorry to the old whoever, you're out now. Yeah.
Your time has come. Like your position is usurped. I mean, it is kind of outrageous. I mean, but it does kind of make me want to pose my next question really whilst we're talking about it. So obviously with work that does feature queer characters, there's always this kind of thing surrounding it about, does their backstory need to be told to say how, you know, they came to be queer? Do you need to go back into their history, or can they not just exist as a queer? I recently read Lesser Known Monsters by Rory Michelson. So that's a dark queer like horror fantasy, and it's based in our world, but again with that twist behind it. And all of the characters in that, they just show up, they are who they are, it doesn't need any explanation. There's a trans character in it that doesn't have to go into any of their coming out story, any of the ins and outs of who they are, you know, their identity. They just are, and it's wonderful to read. It's also a fantastic story. So yeah, I mean, I don't have the link, but Rory Michelson, Let's Learn Monsters, make a note of that. It's a very good book. So yeah, what are your guys' thoughts on kind of queer characters just turn up and exist? Oh, I think we've lost Jess. I think we've lost Jess, so I'll start with Nathan.
Okay. I think it becomes even more important in YA and middle grade, if I'm going to be honest, that it just is. Because one of the things when I was writing a YA, I am not the YA age demographic anymore and haven't been for a couple of decades. So when I decided to write a YA, or it was decided for me by Sandy, one of our editors, I went to a bunch of GSAs, like local GSAs, and it was mind-boggling to talk to these teenagers who could be out in high school. Like that was so far removed from my own experience. And one of the first things they said when I asked, like, you know, what are you looking for? What are you tired of? Well, the second I said, what are you tired of? It was like a unanimous cry of coming out. Like they don't want it anymore. Now that said, I'm in a liberal, fairly white city. Like it was a bit different if I was talking to groups of kids that, you know, were a bit more racially diverse. They were like, I'd like to see coming out stories with my community. I'm like, well, that's not a story that's mine to tell, but noted. So I kind of stepped away from the coming out story completely. He's out. He's out on page 1. That's it. You know, and it just is. And he has his group of friends in the GSA, and you know, there's maybe mention that 1 or 2 of them had a bit of a bumpy road, but that's it. I don't go into it. And you know, there's another character in the book who's kind of struggling with his bisexuality a little bit, but as far as struggles go, it's nothing. Like it's more like, when do I tell people? Not can I, like, should I, or do I need to come out? So it was really freeing. And really kind of neat not to have to sort of pack in some backstory of the trauma or whatever it was. And I mean, I do that. If that makes sense for a character, it's going to be there. But no, I think especially in YA and middle grade, I think you're right. I think the horrible, tragic past, let's just show some of them existing, has to be is a new, wonderful thing that we have the freedom to do.
I mean, there's a delicate balance, isn't there, that you have to strike up between, is their past relevant? Has it affected their current events? You know, what's happening? Is it integral to the plot? Is it going to do anything, or is it just like voyeuristic? Like, oh, let's talk about this horrible thing that happened because it's really juicy to read. You know, that like you just don't. Yeah, you don't have to go there. Sometimes queer characters can just show up, and that's it. And Brey, what about yourself with your sort of queer characters that you write?
Yeah, it's the same. I think it's the same. Yeah, it's very much, they just show up. They are who they are. Like you say, Thom, if it's relevant, you know, if there was some kind of thing about it, you know, that's affected them currently. But I think that's one of the nice things about fantasy and sci-fi is you're allowed to move beyond our realm a bit, and they can just be. You know, they can just be whoever they are, and you don't have to pack in that reality of the ugly stuff, you know, which I love. So yeah, my characters are all they're just gay. There's no
gay
like
as the
big
day is long.
question. That's it. They're just happy-go-lucky lesbians, you know, and they're doing their thing. So yeah, that's mine. Just show up for sure.
I mean, excellent. I mean, it's obviously not a fantasy, but it has been a little bit of a phenomenon. Is the TV series Schitt's Creek, if anyone is familiar with it? And David Levy was very adamant when he wrote it. He said it needs to be an environment where everyone, they just are who they are and no questions are asked. And it's like in a small hick town, it's supposed to be, obviously. And there's like an openly black lesbian, and then David is pansexual, and everyone's just kind of doing whatever they want to do, and that's it. It's fine. It doesn't need to be explained or elaborated upon or anything like that. So yeah, wonderful. Jess, I'm not sure how much you've caught of the question or the conversation, but
I'm sorry, my internet keeps going in and out, so
yeah.
I caught nothing.
That's absolutely fine. So I was really just asking about this kind of idea of backstories for queer characters and whether they need to be told in your writing if it's not integral to the plot. Do your queer characters just show up as they are and just get on with their day?
Yeah.
And do you think that that's kind of the most, because, you know, the question that was raised about, do you think that's the most important way to do it? Because, you know, some people are very sick of a coming out story, whereas other people might still be in a position where they would want to read a coming out story.
I think there are different stories for different readers, and I think different writers have different things to say, and I think there's absolutely a place for new coming out stories, because you know, a lot of our lives are coming out stories, and there's room for that. I don't write them. At least I haven't yet, but I have read some, and I think there's room for all types of stories.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, and this sort of touches on what you were saying before, Brey, about that. That is the wonderful thing about sci-fi and fantasy, that you just create the world as it is, and you can't argue with it because it's fantasy. So no, I will not be taking any questions or feedback at this point. Everyone is just a happy-go-lucky lesbian, and it is.
Yes. Exactly.
Oh my goodness. So I mean, I'm just checking the time, so I will make this my final question, but I could chat to all three of you all morning about this subject, but I'll reel it in. So there's still time for questions at the end. This might be one to start with you, Nathan, in particular, based on the blurb from the your most recent publication. So do you think if it's a queer fantasy or sci-fi, does it need a romance or a love story to kind of drive it? Otherwise, you know, it's not queer enough.
So I'm going to start with 100% unequivocally no, it does not have a romance. If only because, you know, aromantic people are queer. So from there, immediately, it's step one. We have the no, queerness doesn't have to.
Well, I only read the blurb, so I've caught myself out there.
No, but it does absolutely. This one that I've written is a romance. But I will say that is a ongoing frustration of mine as someone who does step into different genres, is when the cover screams fantasy, the blurb says fantasy, the categorization says fantasy, and then review after review after review talk about how weak the romance is. I get so frustrated, and I know reviews aren't for authors, but holy crap, it is so frustrating to watch when, as a queer author, if I write it, and this mostly comes from outside the queer community, because gay fiction tends to have a lot of readers who aren't gay men, and so there's this outside group, I guess, who will read it and they get really mad if I fade to black, or if I don't include a sex scene. I'm like, sorry, they're busy saving Ottawa from a supernatural evil. They don't have time to go make out. Like, but yeah, so that one's a big bugbear of mine, that no, it absolutely doesn't have to have a romance, no.
Well, I disagree. No, I'm kidding.
Well, but the thing is, like, I was queer before I had a boyfriend. People are straight before they get their first girlfriend or boyfriend too, but for some reason, as soon as it's queer, oh, you got to have the naughty bits.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, what else is there point in existing if not to amuse us with kissing other people? Oh my goodness. Jess, what about yourself? How much
I have to agree
romance
with
do you
Nathan.
ingest?
I have to agree with Nathan. I've gotten slammed by people writing their Amazon reviews and things saying, why does this mystery that is marketed as a mystery and has a mystery cover and says mystery, where's the sex? And you know, no, there does not have to be romance. There does not have to be sex. I like to write my characters in different kinds of relationships. Some are romantic and some are not. And the romantic relationships, I often like to put them in different points of the relationship, not just following here they meet in the beginning and then there's some turbulence and happily ever after. I'll put them in the middle of a relationship or toward the end of a relationship, or, 3 years in when you're starting to get bored with each other, or or not in a romantic relationship at all, because again, they're a little bit too busy saving the world from the bad guys or whatever.
Well, it's interesting you both touched on that, because my husband, his friend bought him a book that was called like Monsters in the Closet, and it was all like self-published short stories that were very like horror fantasy. And he was reading it with a frown on his face. I remember this so vividly. It was like, what's wrong? He's just like, well, they were being chased by like a load of monsters, and now they've stopped in this warehouse and they're having sex. He was just furious about it. He was just like, and the worst part is it's not even like a well-written sex scene. So not only are they running for their lives, but they're like, oh, we better have a shag. Like, it's making no sense. Oh my goodness. And Brey, over to you to take it on home for the win. What are your feelings on this subject?
See, this puts me in a very difficult position.
Ooh, okay.
Because romance is the biggest selling genre in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Like it is monstrous. So so we're aware that like keeping the romance in these novels is a huge selling point within our market. So it becomes a balance of like not stopping to have sex while the monsters are chasing you, but like, after, like in that breath in between when you're like safe,
let's celebrate,
and then you can have sex. Right. Then you celebrate with sex and get to know each other a little bit. And then you can run from the monsters again in the morning, right? So like there's you have to build in the space for it. I think so. We do see romances in a lot of things. So like James Bond, right? You take on your stereotypical kind of action thing, and there's always a love interest in it. It's not deep or meaningful, but there is some kind of relationship in it, and you see that in a lot of movies and of various genres. So I think it's not unusual to have a romance in it, but the depth of what you explore in it and the way that you handle it, I think, is really important.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think it can add an emotional element that connects the reader to all the other stuff going on as well, and kind of the higher stakes. So that's my professional opinion.
I mean, and personally, I'm just a big old sap. So to be honest, if there's romance in it, I will tend to enjoy it if it is well written. However, yeah, if they stop in the warehouse to just have a shag, I'm going to question their motives at that point. Oh my, I mean, I really could continue chatting so much about all things queer and fantasy and sci-fi, but I am aware that I've gone off my own schedule by a whole English minute and a Canadian minute as well. So I will now just see that there are some questions in the Q&A for you all. So this one's come from a Kirsty. And Kirsty's asking, what's the weirdest thing that you guys have ever done in the name of research for your books? Oh, excellent. Nathan, how about yourself? The weirdest thing?
Oh my gosh. I have taken some tours of some pretty sketchy places. And so
I put myself in physical danger.
I cannot give you the details of this because it was technically illegal. But here in Ottawa, there's a place that I wanted to include in my story. I thought I could maybe tour it. It turned out that no, it's blocked off and locked, but I knew a guy who knew a guy. So we basically snuck in the middle of the night for this place where I will not mention, but if you've read Triad Blood, I think it's the first one, the scene with the cats, that's yeah, so that place, yeah. Don't arrest me, I'm sure there's a statute of limitations.
I didn't hear anything. I know that this is being recorded, but I didn't hear a word of, anything illegal. Jess, where is your research taking you? What strange approach is?
I'm pretty boring, and
I'm sure that's not true.
I moved to Edinburgh, and I'm researching Edinburgh.
I mean, Edinburgh's got enough of a juicy history if you go far enough back and start to see about, I mean, I grew up in Scotland, so actually know quite a lot of the gory sides of the history where there's lots of like, people used to be hung, drawn and quartered and have their head put on spikes. It was like, what?
A lot of the ghost tours. I do take a lot of the ghost tours because a lot of them are actually really informative and interesting. Then you find yourself walking around tunnels underneath the city at 11 o'clock at night, and
I mean, that's pretty precarious. I would say that's not that boring an activity, really. I mean, you're doing better. I mean, the most outrageous thing I can remember doing recently is I Googled at what temperature do you freeze to death? And it's like, anyone looked at this? They're probably going to think I'm trying to like put someone in a box test freezer or something. I was just curious. It was research.
Just no.
Yeah, exactly. My inquisitive nature. Brey, how about yourself? Nothing illegal, I hope.
I wish. I feel really boring now that Nathan's done something so exciting. And no, I love to travel. I love to go to the places I'm writing about to really get the sense of them. So, going to this weird little temple in Scotland, and driving down these one-track roads, and then talking to this other lesbian couple who have their little dogs in backpacks, who then just start telling us all about the area and where we should go and what we should see, and then them getting in touch in Facebook and being like, thanks for the chat, I hope you went to so and so, and that's really cool connection. But going to Greece, because I'm writing Greek mythology, and going to the temples and walking around them and trying to get the scope of them and really get the feel of it. And sometimes that really changes the novel, because you realize that what you were writing isn't actually quite right. And if this other thing happened, it would make more sense. So, standing across from, I had this character who was killing a lot of people. And I had written something, but standing in the area where she'd killed her kids and her, melted these other people, I saw her escape route from where I was standing, and it was completely different from what I thought. So I actually went across the water to the other side of the bay, and there were graves there from the period of time that I was writing in. So I realized suddenly that that's where she buried her kids. And I mean, it created a whole different outlook for me, which was amazing.
Fully, just completely immersed in the landscape. It's I mean, talk about grounding things in your fantasy and reality. You went to the location.
Right, yeah. She melts people with poison, and then I figure out where she goes.
I mean, what a hard life. I better go to Greece, I suppose. if I'm going to do this properly. I'm going to book myself a flight. Oh, how taxing. Any excuse, isn't it?
Any excuse. Absolutely.
This next one's set in New Zealand.
Oh, no.
Another one from Kirsty. I'm keeping an eye on the time. Another one from Kirsty. She's asked, what's one of the most surprising things that you've learned whilst writing your books? like what, it's something that you picked up on, I suppose, or maybe you learned something about yourself. Look at it that way. Jess, how about yourself? Because you obviously must have done a lot of research for historical.
Yeah. Let's see. I think the thing that sticks out in my mind is that the Paris police had female police officers and agents as early as 1812. I found that really interesting. That was when I was actually researching the history of Scotland Yard for the second Ira Adler book, but it turned into that this female police officers in Paris turned into the left hand of justice. So it was useful research in more ways than one.
Amazing. I mean, the other day I Googled what Gucci Gang meant because of the song, and I was very disappointed with the answers. So that's a far more interesting piece of research that you've done. I'll never get those 30 seconds back. Nathan, what's something that you've stumbled across or learned?
I think it's a super random fact, but when I was researching the Chateau Laurier, which is like Ottawa's large former train station, beautiful hotel, I found out that the designer never got to see it open because when he was coming back to see it open, the ship he took was the Titanic.
Oh boy, oh geez, oh wow.
And it was one of those things, I didn't mean to know that, but I found it. I'm like, well, that's going to work.
I picked it up, I'm going to use it. Fabulous. And Brey, I mean, there's got to be some crazy stuff that you've discovered whilst researching mythology.
Yeah, there is, but I actually think as a writer, something I've discovered about myself is that I'm exactly the same as I was in high school. I am a last minute writer. I will wait until the manuscript is due in a month and then sit down and like run at it. I have not changed since I was 16.
So for you, it's a sprint, not a marathon. It's the other way around.
Yeah, most definitely.
I mean, I had to do a course with deadlines to actually write my first novel, so that I can do short bursts, I can do short stories, poems, as much as you like. Writing a novel, that was my Achilles heel, if you will, to quote some mythology back to you. I think, yeah, we've probably got time for a couple more. So, an anonymous attendee has asked a really good question actually about yourselves. How important do you think it is to be out and vocal about your own queerness as an author? And is this ever hard or difficult? I'll continue with you, Brey.
It is important to me. Yeah, it is very important to me. And, working with a queer publisher like Bold Strokes is important to me. It's that visibility thing, and being out there and letting people know, working at Pride events, and standing behind the books and saying, we are here, and look at all these amazing authors we've got and all these fabulous worlds for you to disappear into. It's really important to me. And I think, age has a little bit to do with it. I don't really care what other people think about me being gay anymore. If you have a problem with it, off you go. Yeah. So it's not really hard for me, but I can absolutely respect that it is for other people. And I think that's why it's so important for me to be very out in my queerness as an author.
I mean, the first kind of name that springs to mind, another one of my favorites behind me on the shelf, Chuck Palahniuk didn't come out until much later in his career because his market was so huge. So it was that whole thing of like, oh, is it the right decision? Until you eventually get a case of the, how can I say this? The fuck it. where it's just, it's time. It's time to just come out, and that, and it is what it is. So, I mean, I can really relate to what you've just said, that the visibility and the it's abandoning and betraying is too strong a word, but I can't think of any others for remaining with the belonging of your community, I suppose, than rather than trying to sidestep out of it. I mean, I really relate to that. I want to remain where I am, rather than try and write for people that, I don't know, they're not writing for me, why should I write for them? Nathan, how about yourself?
Yeah, pretty much everything Brey said. So for me, when I came out, I had the traditional disaster come out where like the family cut me off. That was it. We've never really connected since. So for me, a huge part of being publicly out is to just be that example of someone who had that horrible coming out experience. And look, I'm fine. So I think a big part of me being publicly out is just saying, yeah, you know, my happy ever after didn't include that biological family. I've got this amazing chosen family. That's an option for you if you were in this position. But I think the other part of being as out as I can be that I love the most is passing the mic. Again, there's this wide non-queer readership for gay romance, especially. And I love writing gay romance, but I also love the fact that allows me to every now and then go, hey, have you tried Brey Willows? Hey, have you tried, you know, like, look at these lesbian fictions. You keep saying you're these amazing allies. Check out this trans novel, you know, like just try to uplift the voices that don't get the mic as much as we do. And that's something, you know, I'm in a position of privilege, right? Like I'm a white, cis, fairly passing guy. I can do that. Like I get invited to things, I can speak up and I can point out that like, hey, if you want bisexual lady fiction, you really need to check out Rebecca Weatherspoon or Fiona Riley, or, you know, I can do that part. And I love being able to do that.
You've just got a Rolodex like ready to go in your head of just like
you can take the bookseller out of the bookstore, but the bookstore stays in there.
Oh my goodness. And Jess, how about you?
You know, I think representation and visibility are very, very important, because a lot of us are writing the stories that we wish we could have read when we were younger. And at the same time, the degree to which one chooses to live their life in public and visible should be a highly individual thing.
Absolutely. And I mean, this kind of leads me quite nicely onto the final question we have time for. Someone's asking recommended LGBT plus and SSF reads. Go to Bold Strip Books. That's the place to start. You can start with Nathan, you can start with Brey, you can start with Jess, or all three if you're feeling flush. But are there, other than going to Bold Strip Books, from the three of you, final question we have time for, is there anyone else that you could recommend? And Nathan's already answered this, so I'll go to Brey.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've got a ton at BSB, you know, lots of great sci-fi and fantasy writers. We've got quite a few here in the UK, you know, Jane Fletcher and Leslie Davis and Robin Nix, and we've got loads. So, you know, the AJ Hackworth is one that I've just finished, and she wrote, or they wrote, I'm not sure what their pronouns are, Library of the Unwritten.
Did I hear a prompt?
You did.
Thanks, Robin.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Library of the Unwritten, and it's fabulous fantasy. Really, really excellent. And again, her queer character just is there. And it's a queer character of color as well, which is really fantastic. So definitely recommended there.
Fabulous. And Jess, any recommendations that you'd like to add to the ever-growing list? I mean, people have got so much reading to do.
I know. I don't read a huge amount of science fiction and fantasy, but right now I am reading a book called Remember Me Synthetica by Kay Otten, and it is magnificent on so many levels. I'm about halfway through it and I have not figured the story out yet, but it's brilliantly written, and I highly recommend it.
And again, I'll double back and say, although it's not Bold Strip Books, and if you want to support an indie author, Rory Michelson, Lesser Known Monsters, I really did enjoy it. I mean, you could say it's a bit of a sandwich, but it's a really good sandwich. But yeah, we are only 1 minute over, so I think we've done incredibly well with the amount of scope that we have covered. So I would just like to thank Leeds LGBTQ Lit Fest again for having us here, for hosting us. And thanks to this wonderful panel that I've been able to engage with this morning. Thank you again to Nathan. and to Brey and to Jess. And it's weird because no one's clapping. How dare this only be on Zoom? I meant the audience, not you guys, but no. Yeah.
And thank you so much,
Thank you.
Tom.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
The
And
pleasure has been mine.
just to mention too, to check out Tom's Arthole website and all his performative art, which is amazing. And just, he's also the chair of the Nottingham Writer Studio, and he does a spectacular job with the writing studio, getting authors in and involved and running courses. And he is amazing. So thank you, Tom.
I mean, I was off duty, but if you would like to go to Nottingham Writers Studio .co.uk, there are a lot of courses on Zoom as well as in the studio. So yeah, we'd be more than happy to see you there. We're actually doing at the end of July, I'll just do a very quick plug with performance poet Sophie Sparham. We're doing a like a pride party, which is writing some bangers from gay anthems. Using the lyrics as inspiration, so you're more than welcome to that. But yes, thanks again to all of our people that asked questions, to our panelists, and once more to the festival for hosting. And I will leave it there. Enjoy the rest of your day. And Nathan, maybe go back to bed, it's still super early. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.